Hi, welcome back to Tig's Creations. Today's episode is entitled the Live Edge Cherry Riverboard Project. It's subtitled How Being Cheap Can Be Advantageous Sometimes. The reason why I gave it that subtitle was that I was out at a lumber store in just west of Atlanta, and I was picking up some wood there that I'd already seen, and I was wandering around some of their scrap areas, and I came across this piece of cherry. It had a gorgeous patina, but it had a really severe warp in it. So for really hardcore furniture makers and people like that, it was a really little or no use. Being frugal, I looked at it and thought, well, maybe because I'm not making live edge riverboard tables, or at least not for the most part, maybe I could take this, cut it down, work around the warp in the wood, and take a really nice piece of wood and produce it into something that would be of interest to people. So that's what this project became. So without further ado, here we go. So like the fool that I am, I forgot to take a picture of the whole slab that this piece came from. But I think you can see quite easily that it's got a wicked bow in it. But I decided if I just cut off the outer edges that maybe we could make some use of it. So the next thing to do is take it to the bandsaw and by eye cut out a relatively straight line down the edge of this piece of wood. As you can see, it's rocking all over. You couldn't do this cut on the table saw, so I just flipped it over and did the same process on the other side, and we'll see what happens. The thing about this is that you tend to think that you're throwing a whole load of wood away here, but actually this outer piece I can resaw. So the next thing you do is take the equivalent of a really large spoke shave and take off the worst of the bark, and then what you do is you get your favorite angle grinder with a sander wheel on it and play havoc. The reason for doing this is if you don't do this step, once you put the wood in the mold and pour the epoxy, air bubbles from the bark and the loose wood just keep coming out during the process of it curing and kills the end product. So now, because there's a bit of a warp in it still, one side is relatively flat, so I take this now and put it on a piece of MDF, put the flat surface down on the MDF, and now I can take it over to the planer and gradually plane off the remaining bit of the warp. You can see at the bottom right side that edge is getting taken out slowly but surely as I run it through the planer. So then the next thing to do is just cut these pieces down to size to fit in the molds that I have for making the riverboards. They're 18 inches long, so you just make a nice square edge, mark out, off you go, you're ready to go and put it into the mold. The molds I use for making these boards are from extruded HDPE, but it's still advisable to put a silicone spray on the board to make sure that nothing sticks. A word of caution, make sure your boards are nowhere near the mold when you're doing the spraying. But you then just place your boards down into the mold. And one thing that I found out to my cost is that you've really got to clamp these boards down, because it might surprise you to know that wood floats in epoxy. Muggins here never thought about that the first time he did this, and it was a complete disaster. So it's really worthwhile taking a little bit of time to clamp down the boards to the base so that the epoxy doesn't just get under either of the boards that you're putting in there and completely screw up your project. Once you've done that, you get set to go. So once again, I'd failed to record some of the most vital information as to how I calculated the volume that I needed for this particular pour. I'm using here a 2-inch clear casting resin from Pourable Plastics. I'm not sponsored by anybody, but this has been working for me, and the pigments that I'm using are black diamond pigments. I use pigments for this type of thing, but acrylic dyes I use in other things. But as you can see, I'm just mixing it up to get to the final colour that I think will probably work. The nice thing about the mica is that it gives you this opacity. The one thing that you have to do before you pour is get all the bubbles out of the epoxy. So here I'm just putting it into a vacuum system where I'll take it up to about negative 25 psi. That'll begin to take all of the bubbles out of the system, out of the epoxy before I pour it. And you know, you can see it beginning to get the vacuum pressure as it comes on now. I'll have to make another video about how I calculate the volume that I need and where these bits and pieces come from. I apologize for that. I'm new to this, so this is the best that I can do for the time being. As I say, I am not sponsored by anybody, so all of the things that you see are simply bits of equipment that I'm bought in out of my own pocket, and if anybody wants to sponsor me, then that's fine, but I'm in no way saying this is the be-all and end-all of the equipment that you need. So once the bubbles have been taken out, you just get your epoxy and you start pouring it into the system. It's best to do this relatively slowly because you can see there's bubbles forming here just from the pouring process, even though the vacuum has taken most of the worst effect of that. The thing that you want to try and avoid is for the epoxy spilling over on the edges, because it's a real bugger getting rid of epoxy. But one thing you can do is you can get rid of the surface bubbles immediately just by taking a blowtorch to the top. It frees up the liquid tension on the bubbles and they disappear. One thing that is worthwhile doing is going in over the first day and just taking out the extra bubbles as they come up. There's no way of avoiding this, but you can avoid holes in your project later on. So then when you get to this stage, this is 3 days later, the epoxy's cured. Now you just belt out the edge of the mold, give it a tap on the base, and hopefully it drops out and you're ready to go. You can see there's still some seepage on the bottom side, but nowhere near as bad as when you don't clamp it down. And there's the surface. So the way the molds are made, the edges are on an angle, so you have this extra epoxy on the top, bottom and sides, and so the next thing to do is just trim it down so everything's straight. Make sure you do have it clamped down, because you know this is pretty hard cutting that you're doing. So you just take off the top and the bottom on the this is a compound miter saw. Again, as I say, I'm not sponsored by anybody, but I really do like this DeWalt system. It's very nice. So you just trim it down to the end, and then you repeat the process on the other side. Now you take it over to the table saw and edge it off on either side. This squares everything up. It's also messy as all hell. This is with a vacuum dust collection system on, but it still kicks off all of this. So once everything's trimmed down on the miter saw and the table saw, the next thing to do is get off the worst of the excess epoxy on both the base and the bottom of the boards. I bought this jet drum sander. It cost me more than I wanted to pay for it, not a huge amount. Okay, so the next thing I like to do for these boards is round out the edges using my router table. It's really relatively straightforward. I've done the upper side here, as you can see. Now just rounding out the bottom side. You don't need to be precise at this point. As you can see, there's some upper level grooves there, but the subsequent sanding is going to take that down so that you won't be able to see it. It just, for me, gives a much nicer feel for these boards. Some people might say, well, you know, square edges, yeah, fine. It's just personal opinion, isn't it? I'm not saying somebody's right or somebody's wrong. I'm just saying this is the way I do it. So here you go. There's the board. So this is the board straight off the router table. 120 grit. I'm going to use this to take all of the worst imperfections of the routing, cutting, whatever you want to say. Use it to also level the board itself, because not everything is perfectly true. So a quick spritz of mineral oil will give you an idea of what the board's going to look like. So once the mineral oil has evaporated, quick spritz of water at this stage. This has been sanded down to 180 grit. You just take the worst bit of the excess water off. This allows the grain to rise. You flip it over, do the same on the other side, and then allow it to dry out. Then you can sand this down again up through 320 grit, and then put your oil on. What this means is that when the product's finished, you're going to have a much smoother finish, A, and B, if it gets water on it, it's not going to raise the grain, and you're going to be good to go. It's still going to feel as good as it was when you finished it and handed it over to the buyer. With all the best intentions, you still do get the occasional bubble in the epoxy, so you can see couple have come up here and I can just clean them out with this toothpick. A quick workaround is to use cyanoacrylate glue, CA glue. Just dab it in there and fill up the holes, and then give a quick spray with an activator, and you'll be in the process of finishing out those imperfections. Here's the spray. Once it's on, check it out. Once it's finger dry, you're good to start sanding. So now you go in here with a 320 grit. You're not wanting to push it hard down again, you're just wanting to fill those little holes up. I mean, there's nothing else in the rest of the board, so this is really just a question of getting it as perfect as you possibly can. So one final little dust over and everything begins to look okay. The resin's flat, looking nice, and the wood's looking good. And so as I say, this is 320 grit, so this is really fine. Give it a squirt with mineral oil again, give it a wipe down so that you can see what it looks like, and I hope you agree that it looks pretty nice. Now what we'll do is we'll progress on to oiling this puppy up. Here I'm using an Osmo oil wax finish, which I really like because I really do think it brings up the grain and the texture of the wood really nicely. Okay, so the next step in the process is to stamp my Tig's Creations logo on the back of the board, and for this I use a brass branding iron that you can see in the top of the board there. From experience, I've learned that it takes about 3 minutes to get the brass mold hot enough to leave a nice clear impression on the wood. Once it's hot enough, you just press it relatively firmly down on the wood and rock it a little bit to make sure that it embosses nicely, and there you go. So to finish this final step, what I'm doing is applying a ceramic surface coat that I bought from Black Forest Wood Company. It has a base coat and then this ceramic top coat. I've already applied the base coat and the first coat of the ceramic, and now this is the second coat. Goes on, it's really thin, it's an easy application, brings out a sort of semi-gloss on the wood and the epoxy really nicely. I'll leave this for half an hour now and then come back and buff off the excess, and that will be done. I forgot to tell you why I used the Black Forest Wood Company ceramic coating. It makes the wood waterproof because the ceramic is hydrophobic, and it also adds a degree of abrasion resistance. So there you have it. That's the tale of how a badly warped live edge cherry slab was transformed into a perfectly flat cherry riverboard with an epoxy center. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next episode. Bye.